Chimera, the tissues of diverse genetic constitutions. Welcome, my friends. Welcome to another production of Cepher Moments. I'm Stephen Pigeon. We're going to be talking about an interesting topic tonight, one I wasn't planning on doing, but it looks like we've gotten there. So we're going to be discussing this issue of chimeras. Now, it's a funny thing about these things. This particular image is an image that appeared earlier on Telegram, on one of my Telegram channels. I don't know if it was Sherry that put it up or who it was, but this appears to be an archaeological find on the island of Cyprus that was initially believed to be multiple animals. But as they dug further and they began to put the whole skeleton together, and the skeleton gives evidence of what appears to be part man, part ram, and possibly part horse or a centaur. Now, maybe this is a photoshopped image, maybe it isn't, but it does give us the opportunity to talk about what is involved in this particular image. Because we can see that, as we were discussing in some of the classes on Cepher Academy earlier today, that there are many things that are in Scripture that are surprising. And one of those surprises is the cyclic nature of the earth itself. Now we see, for instance, that the heavens around us evidence a cycle. For instance, we have a moon cycle that's 29 and a half days. We can witness it go from dark moon, or what's called the conjunction, to the full moon, or what's called the opposition, and back to the dark moon every 29 and a half days. It also has a cycle that allows it to join back to its starting point in relationship to the sun, called the Montanic, which takes place every 18 years, 7 months, roughly. The sun also has its cycle. We don't know exactly what all those cycles are, but we know that the earth has a cycle. We have a daily cycle, and we have an annual cycle where we come back to where we were every 365.25 days. Maybe that was different at some other period of time, but that's the way it measures out to be today. So one of the big questions that's on the table is there such a thing as potentially a heavenly cycle? That is to say, when we talk about the planetary system, or we talk about what we see in the heavens, is this subject to a cyclical return every 7,000 years? That's a big question. And if so, if there is a cyclic return, then the question becomes, okay, is the Scripture silent on that? And it doesn't appear that to be the case, because it appears, for instance, that we have evidence of Noah's flood, and the Scripture tells us of Noah's flood, and it forewarns Noah that there's going to be a flood coming. And of course, then many cultures have the same narrative concerning the flood, although they use different names. Then you see Peter say, well, the first time mankind was destroyed by a flood, but the second time it shall be by fire. So we have some discussion here at this point that there's going to be a second termination, if you will, of the heavens and the earth. Now, it may not be a termination completely of the heavens and the earth, but it may be a destruction on the heavens and the earth, and the heavens and the earth. And so this is what we see, that when you look to the idea of this destruction, that there appears to be earthly cycles, and they appear to be a 7,000-year cycle. And so we get this kind of indication that there'll be 6,000 years of mankind going into a 7,000-year millennial reign. Now, there's been a lot of discussion recently that the millennial reign already happened and that we're in the period of Satan thereafter. And this is kind of a preterist view. I disagree with that view. I don't think that's right. I think that Genesis 1:1 gives us a pretty clear indication that, in fact, we see the Aleph Tav in in the fourth word, and we see the Aleph Tav in the sixth word, giving us an indication that, in fact, Mashiach would be here at the end of 4,000 years and at the end of 6,000 years. Now, it's not specifically spelled out, but it does appear to be predicted in the scripture. Now, also, when we get to Genesis 1-2, we were looking at that very in depth today at Cepher Academy, looking at these words tohu bohu, which appear to indicate in their first sense that tohu is actually means a destruction. It's been destroyed and a ruin. And so better to say, and the earth was destroyed and a ruin, than to say it was formless and void. It's much closer to the words. Well, if it was a ruin and destroyed, well, that means that it was something else before that, which could mean, of course, that there is a cycle. Once again, a destruction that came on the earth, and that destruction was then healed, and another epoch began, or another epoch picked up. How many times has that happened? We don't know. But it's possible that it is in a 7,000-year cycle. Of course, it's possible that it's a 12,000-year cycle. I don't know. But I mean, the way the scripture points to the sevenfold doctrine of his whole creation in Ezekiel 93:12. And this is telling us that this very well could be a 7,000-year cycle. Now, also you see the phrase that appears in Revelation many times, the first and the last, the beginning and the end, who was, who is, and who is to come, giving us an idea that there was a prior epoch, now the current epoch, and now a later epoch. Well, the archaeological record that's now being unearthed, and it's being unearthed because knowledge is increasing, that when we see the archaeological record, there are many things that appear to have predated the flood. If you accept the biblical narrative, and you may want to say, well, gee, the patriarchs lived longer, but in the current narrative, the flood was approximately in 2500 BC, 2500 BC. And there appears to be a record that goes before 2500 BC. So we're talking about 4,500 years ago. And now, so when you look at megaliths that appear to be 4,500 years old, for instance, Nowthdowth and Newgrange in Ireland, very possible post-flood megaliths. But what about the megaliths that are older than that? For instance, the megaliths that are on the island of Malta, which have a dating associated with their ability to see Sirius that puts them at about 10,000 years old. There's other megaliths that have similar dating. For instance, the Göbekli Tepe megalith, which its cosmology that's written out on its sides indicates that cosmology points to roughly 10,000 years ago. Well, 10,000 years ago, if you minus the 4,500 years to the flood, puts you about 5,500 years into a 7,000-year prior epoch. Now, there's reason to believe that Genesis 1:1 does teach of a prior epoch. That is to say, in Genesis 1:1, we have a discussion about Elohim creating man in his own image. It says, and Elohim said, let us create man in our own image and likeness. Let us create man in our own image and likeness. And Elohim created them, male and female, he created them. And so this shows beings, whereas in the narrative in Genesis 2, Hua is taken from Adam. But in Genesis 1, male and female are created at the same time. And so we see in Genesis 1 the use of Zakar and Nekabah. Zakar and Nekabah, and Zakar and Nekabah are premises that are talking about the idea of male and female. Zakar, him who remembers; Nekabah, the one who is pierced or even violently pierced. And this is what the meaning of these two words are. So we see the creation of both male and female at the same time in Genesis 1, but in Genesis 2, we see the creation of Adam, and then a portion of Adam is taken to create the woman. Well, it's quite interesting if the portion that was taken from Adam was not taken, but rather duplicated. So in Adam, you have a DNA propensity, Y DNA and X, or the Y chromosome and the X chromosome constituting the male. But with the female, we see an X chromosome and an X chromosome. Now, where does this put us? This puts us, and by the way, the other X chromosome is different than the first X chromosome. So one is of a heavenly creation, and the other is of an earthly duplication. There is no rib. The rib was used as by the translators to tell you that they wanted to put something. It was a part of the man that was taken. But nobody was thinking in terms of genetics, even though we can see that the very book, Genesis, has got genes right in the title. So when we talk about this genetic disposition, was there a genetic similarity between Zakar and Nekaba in Genesis 1 and Adam and Hua, who are called Ish and Isha in Genesis 2? Well, maybe, but then again, maybe not. Because we see something very interesting. When you see that Elohim is the one who creates male and female in Genesis 1, these are the creation of Elohim. And so you might call them the sons of Elohim or the Beni Elohim. Beni Elohim. So when we look at the Beni Elohim, are the Beni Elohim discussed in Scripture? Well, the most assuredly they are. We're going to get to that here in our discussion today. In fact, let's get to it now. Whoop, went too far. Let's go back here. Right here, okay? Genesis 6:4 or Bereshith 6:4. There were Nephilim in the earth in those days who also gathered afterward. After what? When the Beni Elohim came in unto the daughters of Adam. Now you see, who was it? Was it the Nephilim who came into the daughters of Adam? No, it was the Beni Elohim, the sons of Elohim. The Beni Elohim came in unto the daughters of Adam, and they bore children to them who were warriors and tyrants from time out of mind. Mortal men of renown. Mortal men of renown. Now, this gives us a very clear indication that possibly the Beni Elohim were not mortal. Were not mortal. So when we see this idea of the Beni Elohim, so we've got some connotation here, but the offspring of the Beni Elohim are going to be mortal. They're going to be mortal. And so when we talk about this idea of the Beni Elohim coming from this chapter 1, who are these Beni Elohim? Well, they're discussed in Job 1:6 and in Job 2:1. And the passage says that the Beni Elohim stood in the presence of Yahweh, and Hasatan was with them. And Yah said to Hasatan, "From whence do you come, Hasatan?" And he said, "From going to and from the earth and back and forth thereon." Well, this is very interesting, because this gives us an indication that the Beni Elohim had the capability of going back and forth to the earth and to and from the earth, back and forth into heaven, and then back and forth on the earth itself. So was there a class of being created in Genesis 1 that was in fact immortal? Now, there's nothing saying anywhere that we know of that angels die. There's nothing saying that angels die. And when we talk about angels, again, the word there is really not a good word, because the word is better said messenger, because the word in Ivrit is malak. And malak does not mean a person in white linen with white fluffy feathers. It means a messenger, a messenger. And so when we look at this, the average person in the average church believes that angels were created before mankind. The average person in the average church believes that a portion of those angels rebelled and were kicked out of heaven. Ezekiel 28 and other places tell us this, and Revelation tells us it was 1/3. But when you see that these angels were kicked out of heaven, some of these angels that were kicked out fell. And this is what the word nafal means, the fallen one, to fall, nafal. And so these angels, there's nothing depicting that saying these angels die. In fact, even the book of Hanok does not say they die. It says that the angels that fell, that did the deed, which was to transgress, and instead of watching over humanity, they instead attempted to rule over humanity. And they also had relationships with humanity, including human women. So as a consequence, they fell and they created classes of beings, Naphalim, Nephilim, and Eliud, as the book of Hanok tells us. And all of these were mortal men. They were mortal. So there was a mortality that came on. Now, how did this mortality happen? Well, when we look at the B'nai Elohim in Genesis chapter 1, they were not subject to the fall that would take place with Adam and Hua, who would eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and bring death into the world. So the difference between the B'nai Elohim in Genesis chapter 1 and Ish and Isha in Genesis chapter 2 is that death came into the world to Ish and Isha. Now, not to the generation of Ish and Isha, because mankind is still living, but rather to each person individually. In other words, every leaf falls from the tree, but the tree does not die. And such is the true story of mankind. So these men became, because these watchers, watchers is the best word for it, because these watchers transgressed and then began to have relationships with human women, their offspring became mortal. They became mortal. And so when we see this now, we can see that there was a genetic manipulation going on. Now, one of the problems is a lot of people ask this question. Well, doesn't Mashiach say that angels, like the angels in heaven, are incapable of having relations because, there's not going to be any marriage in heaven? Well, that may be true. But when you look at the scripture, when you look at what is discussed in Hanok, Hanok very much says that they were able to transform themselves to be able to do this. Now, one of the great mysteries that we see in scripture over and over again is, of course, what is this passing the children through to Molech? And remember that Molech is just another pronunciation of Malak. Malak is the word that is used for angel. Molech is the word for some fallen being to whom everybody was passing their children through. Well, there's a real question, because in some of the hieroglyphs that we see the hieroglyphs where these messengers are holding acorns. They're holding acorns. What's this acorn business all about? Well, we don't know, but I think there was something that they knew before the flood in the antediluvian period. There was something they knew as to how to cross the genome. Now, we have learned just recently, you're talking about in the late 1990s, we learned that it was possible to cross the genome. Once the genome was identified, we learned we could cross the genome. We could make changes to people's genetic makeup. We could eliminate genetic propensities for heart disease and diabetes and so on and so forth. But it was also possible to clone human beings and also possible to create chimeras. So when we look and we say, well, the chimeras were impossible, that's just mythology. But here we have this skeleton that possibly is a photoshopped photo, maybe. But then again, maybe not. And this would be showing a chimeric kind of being. Now, when you think of this kind of chimeric kind of being, think of the reality that would come into the consciousness of a human being who has a human mind and has a human torso, but has the body of a horse and the horns of a ram. What would come into the mindset of such a being? What would be the epistemology of such a being? What would be the life view of such a being, right? So when we see this kind of evidence, we know that there is a reality to chimeric life. We know there is a reality of it. And so this is why I say that when you talk about this idea of chimeras existing in the past, we see a mythological record, a substantial mythological record, primarily out of Egypt and Greece and out of Crete, the Mayan culture, or not the Mayan culture, the Minoan culture. We see references to centaurs. We also see references to other chimeras. I mean, half man, half bull, half man, half horse, half man, half lion, half man, half jackal, half man, half hyena, half man, half owl. There's lots of images like this. Now, these might have been metaphorical images. However, it's possible that they weren't metaphorical images. It's possible that there were rare instances of, in fact, chimeric beings living on Earth. Now, this chimeric transplant, now we understand that it's possible to do this. We know scientifically since the mid-90s, we can do this. There was a large discussion during the G.W. Bush administration as to whether or not such practices should be banned. Should there be an international protocol limiting science from being able to explore this particular transgression? And this is a transgression. It is a transgression that is continuous with the transgression that was present with the watchers at the time of Noah. As it was at the time of Noah, so it shall be at the coming of the Son of Man. And is that discussion the result of the crossing of the genome? Well, it's very possible that it is the discussion from the crossing of the genome. And this is one of the reasons why people with a moral compass would say, should we do this? Should we actually do this? Okay. And so, yes, now here's something else that Donna Highsmith says. Could it be that man made of clay and the fallen angels of forging iron, no conscious human and no longer of Yah? Now, I think this is true, that when you talk about any of the creations that came from the B'nai Elohim intermingling with human beings, this created a class of beings that were no longer considered mankind, the creation of mankind. So they were not subject to the rules of that estate. And there's actually passages, I believe it's in the book of Jude in the New Testament, that says the angels who had left their first estate. That's also mentioned in the book of Hanok, because Jude is quoting Hanok. And the book of Hanok, the angels who left their first estate was a, for lack of a better term, a potential dimensional place, a place between maybe a fourth and fifth dimension and our third dimension. And let's talk about the dimensional issue for just a moment, okay? Because when we talk about the dimensional issue, I've mentioned this to you guys before, but I'll just say it again. The realm, our whole consciousness is predicated upon our sensory data. We have 5 senses. We've got sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. And these 5 senses tell us what the world is. Of those, 4 of those are totally subjective. When somebody tells us that something is red in our vision, the only way we can substantiate what they're talking about is through a continual empirical conclusion. Oh, that everybody keeps saying red, and I keep seeing that color right there. Are we certain that the color we see is actually red? Are we certain of that? Because people tell us everybody else calls that red, but for all we know, it could be green. But we're all calling it red, and so you're assumed that color you're seeing is in fact what they call red. But when you start talking about the idea of touch, the idea of smell, the idea of taste, all of these things require empirical data and recreation in the expression of language before you can conclude that in fact your mind is actually perceiving reality. The exception, of course, is the sense of hearing, because with the sense of hearing, we can prove that the sense of hearing is objectively true. And every choir that's ever sung on earth proves it, that it's subjectively true. Because when somebody says, yum, yeah, pine cone, not an acorn. That's correct, CC Frats. A pine cone, not an acorn. So you hear yum, let's everybody sing that note. And then when everybody sings it in tunes, and then somebody sings the third, then we had a harmony over that. You have objective proof that what you're hearing, the data that you're hearing, is in fact what exists. What you're hearing is in fact what exists. So this is the only objective sense you have, is the sense of hearing. This is why Paul talks about that the way that the faith is obtained is by hearing the word preached. Hearing the word preached. So again, when we start talking about knowing reality, even in this area, in hearing, we only hear in a particular frequency range. On a good day with perfect hearing, you can hear as low as 20 hertz and as high as 20,000. The average human being really hears closer to 30 hertz and maybe 15,000, particularly when you're an adult, when you've had your cochlea kind of flattened out and so on. But how about the vision? Well, your vision also sees in a particular set of frequencies. You see colors in a particular set of frequencies. They exist in a frequency. What you don't see is a whole bunch of stuff that exists in frequencies that you can't see or hear, like radio waves, like cell phone waves. You can't see those like 5G, 6G, 3G, 4G. You can't see any of those waves. You can't see the old broadband and the old narrowband. You can't see any of that. But it's existing. It's out there. That's how this communication thing is taking place worldwide, is by cell phone broadcasting. Imagine if you could see those frequencies driving through downtown LA, what you would see. You'd see a map. Suppose the frequencies were red. You wouldn't be able to see the car in front of you for all the frequency data that's going on in the world. Well, so imagine a being that is vibrating at a different frequency than we are, that hears at a different frequency than we do, that sees at a different frequency than we do, that smells, that tastes at a different frequency. We can't see them. They're right there. We can put our hand right through them, but they're vibrating at a different frequency because that's why we can't see them. They're inhabiting a different dimension. Is there reason to believe that there's a different dimension in this world? Well, yes. And again, this is New Testament teaching when Peter says, to Yah, one day is 1,000 years. That's a dimensional statement. It's telling you the vastness of the frequency at which Yah vibrates, at which he sees, which he hears, and so on. Now, we also can get an idea that because these creatures live in other dimensions, is it possible that they can also hear the dimension below them? In other words, we hear 20 to 20,000 hertz, but does the being that is in the next dimension hear from 20 to 100,000 hertz? And the being the dimension after that, 20 to 500,000 hertz. Okay, Cloud asked the question, why we use Avraham and not Abraham in the Cepher? And it has to do with the pronunciation of the bait in the word, in the bait. And you can see this, it's very conspicuous. It's common usage in the Ivrit, not Ibrim, but Ivrit, or Ibrit, but rather Ivrim. And for instance, when you take the name Avi, it comes from Ab, which is father. But in the pronunciation, we use the they for the bait. And that's what we went with. Okay. So when you see this, okay, so here VM says Earth is in a galactic eclipse that has cycles. And so this shows, and VM says there's a cycle that comes every 6,785 years and is extinction level, perhaps asteroid Apophysis. Yeah. Now, this is a very good point, VM, that when you start looking at these cycles, 6,785 years, that's very close to a 7,000-year cycle. What does it say in Scripture? That the days would be shortened or no flesh would survive, right? So we can see here that when we start to look at this now, this appears to give some scientific data and background to the idea that we're talking about roughly a 7,000-year cycle that is ecliptic. It keeps coming back, a galactic eclipse that keeps coming back. So is Scripture silent on that? No, Scripture is not silent on that. That's the whole point. But you have to dig it out. You have to dig it out to find it. And so when we see this cross-dimensional idea, when you see the idea that there is, 7 dimensions out to Yah, and when you get out there, one day is 1,000 years. But are the beings who are in those dimensions capable of seeing, hearing, and understanding the beings that are in lesser dimensions? And I think the answer is yes, because Hebrews 11 says we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses who occupy another dimension, but who are capable of seeing and hearing and knowing and understanding. And so this is something when you talk about Hasatan being a prince of the air, what air? He's in a second dimension or in the second heaven. And it's Paul that makes this reference. It's not somebody else. Paul says, I knew a man that ascended to the third heaven. Well, who's he talking about? But you can see that we've got something quite interesting taking place when you see the idea of Paul talking about a third heaven, the discussion in the ascension of Isaiah of seven heavens, the discussion between one day is 1,000 years to Yah. It's showing us dimensional differences between us. And so as a consequence, we can see that we talk about the B'nai Elohim having the capability to go to and from heaven and back and forth on the earth. Well, who did that we see in the New Testament? There's someone in the New Testament who did that. And that was who? Yahusha. Yahusha did that. He ascended into heaven. He rose from the grave and ascended into heaven. Well, now when he rose from the grave, and again, this was another, I think, a really good discussion we had on Cepher Academy in the Chazon class. We're talking about the idea of the Ben Adam and the Ben Elohim, because you have to remember that Mashiach occupies both of those things, the Ben Adam, the son of Adam, and the Ben Elohim. And so when he becomes the Ben Elohim, this moves him into an immortal status. He moves into immortal status, and in this immortal status, he is capable of coming to and from heaven and back and forth on the earth. He's capable of walking through walls and then sitting down and eating fish and bread. This is not me making this up. This is what's written in the New Testament. Okay, so when you see this kind of thing, when you see Mashiach being able to do that, then he says, it is given to you to become sons of Elohim. This is what it says. It is given to you to become sons of Elohim. What is he talking about? He's talking about us becoming immortal beings. These things and more you will do when you take on his likeness. You see? And so you can begin to see that this idea of the B'nai Elohim, even though the B'nai Elohim are assigned to wicked deeds here in Genesis 6:4, but remember that they're fallen watchers. This is why it opens up, but there were the fallen ones in those days, the Nephilim. There were fallen ones in those days. These were the Nephilim. These were the messengers who left their first estate and betrayed their fiduciary duty towards mankind to watch over them. Okay? Now, what's interesting here is that when we start to see this, we begin to see that these fallen watchers were creating a different kind of DNA. They were creating something that, by the way, the Hindu record, the Greek record, the Egyptian record, the Roman record later, they all record this idea of half gods, right? They record this idea that this one was the result of Zeus having a relationship with a human woman, and Achilles or Hercules or whoever was the child of this. And Achilles and Hercules or whoever it was mortal. And this becomes the battle of the Titans where they fight among one another. Many of them were giants. So one question is, do we believe in giants? That's a question. Do we believe in giants? And the question of do we believe in giants is a big question, because there's clear literature that says that David faced off a giant. There's clear literature that says there were giants in the land in Numbers 13, at verse 33, talking about the sons of Anak. It's clear that they took on a giant when they took on Og of Bashan, whose bed apparently was some 18 feet long. So, and the question is this, how big were the sons of Yasharel? Were they actually gigantic? How big were they? And how big were some of these giants? We see different classes of giants. We see the idea of Nephilim, the first generation, who were probably the largest giants. Then you see Nephilim, who were pretty large giants. Then Eliud, who were probably the giants of Goliath size, right? And yeah, now here we go. David Bowen makes a point right here. Extremely good point, David Bowen. 2 Kings 6, Elisha's eyes are open to see the army of angels. Is this an example of multidimensional perception being open? Yes, that is an example. And if you recall the 85,000 Assyrians that were slaughtered by the angels as well, you can see that the eyes were open to see a whole army of angels standing there. Or how about when you might remember Balaam's ass, who kept saying, "Hey, I'm not going there." And finally, he's beating him and beating him and beating him. And the next thing you know, Balaam looks and he sees a malak and messenger standing in front of him, right? And so we can begin to see now that we've got this record now. We've got a paleo record that's beginning to become replete that says, yeah, giants here, giants there, giants everywhere. And some of these records are very interesting because, like, for instance, we've been looking at some of the geoglyphs that appear to be petrified human beings in stone. And they're kind of miraculous, really, stone settings that are extremely, extremely human looking. But they're huge, massive, huge, huge, huge. And there's also the idea that these mesas that you see down in southern Utah and in Arizona may have been tree stumps of trees that were 1,000 feet tall. I mean, are these things possible? Sure. I mean, what do we know about the record, the antediluvian record, about what the climate of the earth was and about how things lived? But one theory that goes into this is kind of like this. When you look at mankind, mankind has a very interesting genetic propensity, which is to say that mankind has a gene that stops men from growing. So by the time you turn 21, for the most part, there are exceptions, but by the time you turn 21, you're as tall as you're going to get. You're not going to get any taller. You might get wider, but you're not going to get taller. And this is not the case for every species on Earth. Alligators continue to grow their whole life. Sturgeon, the fish, they continue to grow, and they live hundreds of years, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow. So is it possible that before the flood, the antediluvian period, that mankind's genetic propensity was to keep on growing, and that there was no termination to the size? So you started growing, and then by the time you're 50 years old, well, now you're 12 feet. By the time you're 100 years old, you're 15 feet. By the time you're 300 years old, you're 30 feet. And so on it goes. And you would continue to grow your entire life. And when you see somebody, Methuselah, who's in his 900s, or I think 980, I think he died before, and Adam, who was 930 years, how big were they? How big were they? And was it possible that this was the case with the B'nai Elohim as well, that they did not have the gene that limited their growth? And so they just kept right on growing. They didn't stop growing. They kept right on growing. And so we can see that this whole plan here, this whole plan of this genetic propensity now is such that there was something known to these Nephilim. There was something known to these watchers that allowed them to join their DNA to the human DNA. And this is what happened. Now, there's also a record that says that they joined their DNA to animal DNA. It wasn't just human beings. And I believe this record's contained in the Book of Enoch and other places like the Book of Giants and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And what you see is that you see interesting anomalies in the animal kingdom. For instance, it always kind of amazed me that when you look at the Tyrannosaurus Rex, assuming that it's a real artifact, that the Tyrannosaurus Rex is bipedal, and it has it's got opposing thumbs, bipedal and opposing thumbs, yet it has the tail and the jaws of an alligator, except that it keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. So we have reason to believe that there is a genetic side that does not have a termination gene in terms of height. Certain species continue to grow. They don't stop growing. That's not the case with mankind, at least not now. But, okay, so Brian says, blame my 5'4" mom for stunting my growth. Yeah, hey, Brian, I'll tell you what, that's why, I keep drinking coffee trying to stunt my growth. You know what I mean? So anyway, so what you see is that we can see evidence of giants. We can see evidence of the genetic propensity for giants to be. We can see other evidence of the prehistoric record making reference to chimeras and saying these chimeras did in fact exist. And then we have this particular artifact here claiming that this is in fact a centaur. Now it's interesting because this centaur is particularly terrifying given that he has ram horns, a human skull, and the body of a horse. All right. But take a look at this. Did the Nephilim cross the genetic barrier with animals as well as humans? Now, this is an ancient depiction of a geneticized being. And this is what is meant by chimeras, that there would be two or more genetic propensities. Now, a lot of the things that have been talked about since the year 2000 is something that is really kind of scary, which is that, this idea of being able to move animals back into human beings. So, for instance, has there been a genome crossage between pigs and human beings? Some people believe that's true, that there have been some human genes that have been placed into pigs to cause the pigs to be larger and smarter and so on and so forth. And when you see some of those pigs and you see evidence of, what's looking like human characteristics in those pigs, you got to ask yourself a question, right? And so this is, for this to be the case, we can see that there's going to be some really kind of crazy things going on here in terms of this business of creating chimeras in the lab. Okay. All right. So now someone says here, Tyrannosaurus Rex, how do they breed? They can't happen. So catch a hardball. Okay. So SR, yeah, it's possible. So were they in fact, laying eggs and fertilizing that way? I mean, I don't know. Hey, Chimera, good to see you. So anyway, when we talk about this now, let's go on here and talk about, so here again, this is an ancient sculpture of a chimera, right? This is an ancient sculpture of a centaur, So you can say, well, this is mythological. Yeah, it likely is mythological. I mean, it certainly does exist in mythology, but nonetheless, we see this. But now look at this chimera here. Let me just show this to you here. What of the Baphomet? Okay. Now, here we see this depiction. Now, this Baphomet is worshipped in more places than you guys might know. The Baphomet has been presented at many state capitals in the United States, and they've got this sculpture going up all around the world. And we can see here that in this sculpture, we have a being that is half man, half woman, half goat, half man, half bird, half man. Well, maybe it's not half, maybe 20% here, 20% there, 20% in the next place. And of course, we have the caduceus as the genitalia. And again, the ram horns and the star of the Baphomet on the forehead. Okay, so this is, this particular being has been identified also as Pan, who had a grotto, the grotto of Pan, which is at Mount Hermon, which in my opinion is not Mount Hermon at all, but rather is Mount Seir, that is to say the home of the satyr, And so at any rate, when we take a look at this idea of this Baphomet, the Baphomet is a particularly dangerous character and is a dark force that is at work on the earth. Hold on just a minute. Was this actually created? Was this a being that was created during the time of the fallen ones? So at any rate, I just kind of wanted to share that with you guys. I'm going to get off this Baphomet because it's a little too dangerous to be watching. And we're going to go back here to this screen here. Okay, so that is essentially my discussion today, was that I wanted to talk about this and to talk about this chimera and talk about this diverse DNA and to make the point that the DNA is very much a discussion in scripture. When we talk about the seed of Yaakov and the seed of Abraham, and the seed of Abraham is discussed not only in Genesis and elsewhere where Abraham is discussed. But Paul makes direct reference to it in the book of Romans, talking about the seed of Abraham, a single seed. He makes reference to it in the book of Galatians, a single seed, right? And we talk about the seed. People say, well, what about the seed of the woman? Oh, there's no such thing as the seed of the woman. Well, it depends on how you define seed, right? And so when you talk about the idea of having one half of the equation that is going to create life, whether you're talking about the ovum or the sperm, either one of those can be construed as the seed. And so as a result of this, we can see that the prophecy that says that the seed of the serpent will bite at the heels of Mashiach, but the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And these are significant issues, right, in terms of what this seed is. Now, also when we talk about this seed, the question is, did some of this corrupted DNA that took place when the B'nai Elohim transgressed, have relationships with human women, did some of that seed continue? Well, yes, it did continue. And it continued very interestingly, because when you get to Numbers 13:33, and it's talking about the Nephilim, the sons of the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who were giants. And this is well after the flood. These Anakim were in the land. The Anakim were in the land. So the giants, this particular DNA propensity, this DNA that allowed the genetic carrier to continue to grow, under those circumstances, that did in fact continue, at least according to the scriptural record. If you believe the scriptural record, they were there after the flood, as Genesis 6:4 says, that they would be there afterward. And so when you talk about Medusa is a very interesting collection of DNA, James Stephen Emery, because she's depicted as female centaur with the lower body of a horse. That would make her a centaur, yes. But Medusa with the hair of the serpent, right? She had the serpent head. Very interesting too. Again, more than one DNA. And remember that this is the tissue of diverse genetic constitutions. Sometimes more than one DNA, sometimes more than two DNA. Okay, now VM mentions Queen Elizabeth's 70th birthday, where she highlighted, or 70th anniversary rather, where she highlighted a DNA strand, right? It was a triple strand, and the tree of life going to immortality, claiming that the triple DNA, the triple helix DNA, would create immortality. And I'm not so sure that the triple DNA is the key to the B'nai Elohim. In fact, I would say it's definitely not the key to the B'nai Elohim. And this is what we see again when we look in the book of Revelation. It's telling us that the man's number is 144,000. And this is what it says before it divides it up into 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. It says the number of man is 144,000. Well, if you accept the Watson and Crick genome categorization that said there's 72,000 genes descending and 72,000 genes ascending, that means that the double helix DNA is 144,000 and is in fact the number of man. When you add a triple helix from a messenger RNA, then what? In order to be a triple helix, assuming that there are 72,000 genes in each one of the strands, it would have to replicate with a 72,000 gene strand of messenger RNA, Malak RNA. And if it does so, it takes you up to 216,000 genes, which conveniently is the total of multiplying 600 times 60 times 6. So it's very interesting that we see this. And so there is a constant and a continual genetic discussion. This is why the book of Matthew opens up with chapter 1. And, and Abraham, and the son of Abraham was Yitzchak, and the son of Yitzchak was Yaakov, and the son of Yaakov was Peretz, and on and on and on. You get a genetic lineage, a genealogy, both in Matthew 1 and in Luke 3, you're getting a genealogy. You have these genealogies set forth in First Chronicles. You have a genealogy set forth in Genesis, beginning in chapter 10, where the genealogy is given over and over and over again. Why is the genealogy given? Because the genealogy is establishing the lineage of the seed, and it is giving us a DNA link. And so when you look at this in terms of the DNA equation, you can look at this and see, okay, when we talk about the curse that came on David, was David in fact a giant? Is that possible? When we talk about David, when we talk about David and his stance against Goliath, we see that David is eventually, his seed is going to be cursed, that his seed could not sit on the throne of Yahud, Judea anymore. His throne was cursed. But yet Yahshua takes the throne. Why? Because Yahshua came through the seed of the woman, and the Y DNA was miraculous. The Y DNA was miraculous. And so this, when we begin to see this, when you understand in vitro fertilization, for instance, we know that it's possible to do these kinds of things. Was it possible that, in fact, yeah, here he is. Yeah, Jesse puts up, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed, and it shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So we are talking about the seed of the woman, the seed of the woman. And so we can begin to see here that it's not unrealistic now. We know for a fact it's possible to do, that it's possible for an outside source for the Y-DNA to fertilize an ovum. It's very possible for this to happen. And this is the discussion in the scripture, that this was a miraculous Y-DNA that was placed inside of Miriam. And so then Miriam was able to give birth to a child that had a Y-DNA completely free of the curse of David, yet was nonetheless the son of David through his mother Miriam, who was a daughter of Yosef, who was a son of David. Very important discussion. And what we see in the litany between Abraham and Mashiach in Matthew 1 is that it begins with the seed of the woman. Was Yitzchak the only begotten son of Abraham? No, he was not. Abraham had Ishmael before, and Ishmael was the subject of blessing, not cursing. So when you talk about this, idea that, okay, well, who was the only begotten son? Yitzchak was the only begotten son of Sarah. And so the good news begins in Sarah, the seed of the woman. That's why the count starts with Abraham and comes through the seed of the woman in Miriam to the Mashiach. So this gives you an idea that, yeah, there you go. Okay, the seed of the woman being the understanding of the mind, carnal until becoming echad with the ruach, crushing the dominion of the first Adam. Yeah, another good point. Another good point on that, David. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I was hoping for some questions, but given that I'm completely exhausting the subject and there's no possible question left for anyone, then I guess we could just go ahead and kind of wrap this up. So anyway, I'm just going to kind of conclude with this, that the idea of chimeras is most explicitly possible. The idea of giants is given to us in scripture, and there appears to be a substantial paleo record and megalithic record to that effect. The possibility of an in vitro or distinct fertilization of a woman from an outside source is also substantiated in the modern world, as is a super infecundation, where a woman gets pregnant from two different men and gives birth to twins from two different fathers. That's also been substantiated scientifically. So we see a lot of the record has been corroborated, and now we know that chimeras can be created, and that, in fact, there have been probably many chimeras created since the beginning of this century. We just don't know about them. And how many of those chimeras have been slipped into the food supply? We don't know about that either. Okay, so let's see. They are GMO chemtrails, et cetera. All humanity, we can't know if they are eating swine or humans, which is a big concern for all who want to be, clean. Yeah. Now, what you're saying here on that question is you have to be very careful. We do not know when we're eating human flesh, because they're trying to slip it into everything now. They're trying to slip human DNA and otherwise human flesh that's been reduced to some kind of synthetic and then placed into what was said. Okay, let's see. So Jesse says there are some questions about, let's see here, maybe if I can find them. Let's see. Okay, Jess. Well, I'm not seeing them, so I'm just going to kind of scroll down here. All right, let's see. Could these chimeras be a way for the evil rule code to enter this dimension? Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure if it's the chimeras by which they're going to enter this dimension, although depending on how the DNA is put together, when you're talking about a synthetic DNA that's coming out of the laboratory, yeah, I think that does open the door for evil rule code to completely occupy a body. It's also possible that the evil rule code are planning on occupying advanced cyborgs. That may be these organic cyborgs or these genetically formed cyborgs. In other words, flesh being grown in a lab that then attaches. Okay, hey, thank you, Ashton. I appreciate your comment there. Thank you. Blackie says it all makes sense if you allow for time travel and beings outside of time able to enter into any time they choose. That's correct, because they can come in with a substantial body of knowledge, which again, the Book of Hanok substantiates. They taught all kinds of stuff to mankind that didn't know, right? That didn't know. Debbie Johnson says, is all of this pointing back to the DNA strand? Yeah, I think it does. I think it does point back to the DNA. I think this is one of the things we see in Genesis, and it's what we see also in Revelation, pointing back to the DNA strand, the Ish and Isha, right? Okay, all right, let's see. Let me see what else we have here. Let's see. Okay, okay, okay. Is Yahweh pointing back to DNA with them trying to mix RNA? And yeah, and the answer is yes, they are. Yes, it is. And the RNA, again, so much of this mixes, I think the mRNA really, I think just comes out of wickedness with pharmaceutical companies trying to make people sick, so they need more pharma to take care of the sickness that they've been given by pharma. I mean, I don't want to assign that to any particular pharmaceutical, but when you're talking about when you have to take pills to manage the side effects from the pills, to manage the side effects from the pills, well, maybe you need to do something different. Okay, and let's see. Yeah, and so Bill Krajewski says that the Catholic Church and the Christians as a whole don't want to know that angels can regenerate in humans. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it's scary, right? But when you're talking about beings that are eternal, what is the capability of their knowledge, right? Okay, yeah, yeah. What are the blue bloods? Same as Chimera? No, no, I'm not going to say that. The blue bloods are kind of an interbred family. They're interbred. They make sure that they're marrying only cousins. And as a result, they end up with, I'm not so sure it's so prevalent anymore because they've interjected a lot of other bloodlines. But back during the time of the czars, that's one of the problems with the Tsar Nicholas II, that his son he had genetic problems because of the blue blood interrelationship. And it was good. That's what happened. Okay, let's see. Root cutting is some of the following. You find there are companies that can alter genetic bridges. Yeah, there are companies that can alter genetic bridges, right? We know that that's going on now. We know that's happening now. Okay, all right, guys. Well, look, in order to keep from getting booted off this channel, I'm not going to take any other side questions. We're just going to kind of leave it as our discussion on Chimera tonight. So I want to thank you for joining me on Cepher Moments. It's been a blast being here with you today, and I hope to see you for the Shabbat meeting on Saturday. And I also hope to see you in class at Cepher Academy. And if I don't see you in any of those places, drop in and visit us at Cepher.net. We love to see you. Okay. All right, guys. So I want to thank you. Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Debbie. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to thank all of you guys for being here. Jesse, thank you for mediating or administrating this tonight. Your help is always greatly appreciated. And I want to thank all the subscribers for being here. Jim Meyer, it's always good to see you. I want to thank everyone who's here, Dave Barrow, and we will see you hopefully on Shabbat. Okay, blessings to you all. Don't forget to catch me on Radio Free Alaska on Telegram too. That's a good spot where I can talk without getting pumped out, right? Okay. All right, good night, guys. We'll see you later.